George Brown, class clown. Hey, who stole the toilet? Chapter 1. Trees, trees, trues. It was Sunday morning. The Beaver Scouts had gathered at Beaver Brook Park for their weekly meeting. But nobody was paying attention to the troop leader. Instead, the scouts were shooting one another funny looks. Why was George Brown squeaking and squawking? Tease, tease, toos! Tazoo! George squawked again. Cut it out! Louis covered his ears. Is that what you call singing? Louis's two best friends, Max and Mike, both started to laugh. I'm not singing, George said Louis. George told Louis. Tell me about it, Louis said. It sounds like two cats fighting. Yeah, cats, Mike agreed. In a big fight, Max said, with claws and everything. I happen to be calling, George explained. Yeah, right, Louis said. How do you call someone without a phone? Like this, George told him. Tease, tease, toos. Zoo! The Beaver Scout troop leader, Mr. Buttonwood, ducked down as two yellow, brown and white birds flew overhead. Tease, tease! Zoo! The birds called back at George. Okay, George, troop leader Buttonwood said with a laugh. Enough with the bird calls. You really sound like a bird, Alex's George's best friend told him. Yep, George said proudly. It's the call of the warbler. And it's the sound we're going to hear coming out of my birdhouse, and I hang it under that tree over there. George held up a rectangular box made of wood. It had a blue hole in the front. He had built the birdhouse to earn the carpentry badge. I brought the kind of seed warblers like to eat too. How do you know what warblers like to eat? Louis asked him. Do you speak warbler? He was just talking warbler, Max told Louis. Don't you remember? Yeah, tease, tease, zoo, Mike added. Louis scowled. Mike stopped teasing. I know about things like bird seed because I work at Mr. Fritzman's pet shop, George told Louis. Louis didn't answer. Instead, he showed the scouts a huge birdhouse. Actually, it looked like a bird apartment building. It had 4 floors and 16 little tiny rooms. Wow, George blurted out. He couldn't help it. No way he made that, was whispered to Alex and George. He must have bought it. I made this all by myself, Louis told the other boys. Or this with the help of my big brother Sam, he added. More like with the help of the guys Dad paid to help Sam help Louis, George whispered. Alex and Chris laughed. This is a house of purple martins, Louis continued. I'm going to put it on my front lawn. You don't want to hang it here in the park and share it with everyone else in your town? Troop leader Buttonwood asked. No, Louis said. He's being selfish, Chris said. Nah, he's just being Louis, George said. It's a really cool birdhouse, Max complimented Louis. Yeah, Mike agreed. You should get an extra badge for having the best one. This isn't a competition, boys, troop leader Buttonwood told him. Scouting isn't about You should get an extra badge for having the best one. This isn't a competition, boys, troop leader Buttonwood told them. Scouting is about being the best person you can be. I'm definitely the best, Louis said, just like Sam, who was in the Beaver Scouts. He had so many badges, he had to get a second sash. Sam got almost every badge there is. Only one he's missing is the Explorer badge. And you boys are going to earn a lot of badges during the camping trip next weekend, trip leader Buttonwood told the boys. The campground is right near the Baka Waka River. So you have a chance to earn your canoeing badges, and you're going to earn hiking badges too. And of course, you'll get your cooking badges after we make yours over an open fire. We're going to have so much fun, George said excitedly. He'd never been on an overnight campout before. Yes, but this trip is going to be hard work too. Camping separates the men from the boys, Troop Leader Buttonwood reminded everyone. George looked around. The only boy he wanted to be separated was Louis. The first rule of camping is to be prepared. Here's what you need to bring. Troop Leader Buttonwood started to pull a pile of papers out of his backpack. Whoops! Troop Leader Buttonwood shouted as a big wind came and blew the papers out of his hand. The packing lists! The troop leader took off trying to catch the lists. But as soon as he grabbed one paper, another blew further away. Then the scout leader's hat blew off his head and landed in a tree. The troop leader Buttonwood reached to grab his hat. Bam! He slammed his head into the low-lying branch. I'm okay, Troop Leader Buttonwood told the boys as he rubbed the lump growing on his forehead. I meant to do that to show you how important it is to watch out for low-lying branches when we're in the woods. I guess he wasn't prepared for that wind, George said. Well, I'm prepared to earn a lot of badges, Louis said. He looked over at George and laughed. It's too bad they don't give it a badge for acting goofy, he said. You'll get that one for sure. George looked down at the ground. He didn't even answer Louis. What could he say? It was the truth. George did act goofy a lot, but it wasn't his fault. Not at all. Bonk. It was all the fault of a stupid magic super Burp. It all started when George and his family first moved to Beaverbrook. George's dad was in the army, so the family moved around a lot. George had plenty of experience at being the new kid in school, so he'd expected the first day in his new school to stink. First days always did, but this first day was the stinkiest. In his old school, George had been the class clown. He was always playing pranks and making jokes, but George had promised himself that things were going to be different at Edith B. Sugarman Elementary School. No more pranks, no more squishing red jello between his teeth and telling everyone it was blood. No more imitating teachers behind their backs. No more trouble. Unfortunately, being the well-behaved kid in a new school almost meant that George was the new kid with no new friends. No one at Edith B. Sugarman Elementary School even seemed to know he was alive, except for Louis, who seemed to hate him from the minute they met. After that terrible, rotten first day, George's parents took him out to Ernie's ice cream emporium to cheer him up. While they were sitting outside and George was finishing the root beer float, a shooting star flashed across the sky. So George made a wish. I want to make kids laugh, but not get into trouble. Unfortunately, the star was gone before George could finish the wish, so only half came true, the first half. A minute later, George had a funny feeling in his belly. It was like there were hundreds of tiny balloon bubbles bouncing around in there. The bubbles hopped up and down and all around. They ping-ponged their way into his chest and bing-bonged their way up into his throat. And then, burp! George let out a big burp, a huge burp, a super burp. The super burp was loud, and it was magic. Suddenly, George's arms and legs started going crazy. It was like he had lost control of him. His hands grabbed straws and stuck them up his nose like a walrus. His feet jumped up onto the table and started dancing the hokey pokey. Everyone at Ernie's started laughing. The laughing sounded great, just like the old days. Unfortunately, his parents yelling at him also sounded a whole lot like the old days. The magical super burps came back lots of times after that, and even though Alex was trying really hard to help George squelch those birches once and for all, so far Alex hadn't been able to find a cure, and so the burps just kept bubbling. And trouble just kept on coming, like the time with the magic super burp made George start dancing up and down the escalator at Mabel's department store, or the day it made him skateboard right into a bucket of papier mâché goo into the artwork, or the time the burps made him bounce too high on a trampoline that his tidy whiteies got caught on a tree branch on the way down. Ouch! Talk about the worst Reggie. George was really worried about what might happen if the magical super burp followed him into the woods for the campout. The idea of a super burp going wild in the wild was just too frightening to think about. Chapter 2. Okay, soldier, now that we've got the tent set up, it's time for a mess. George grinned. He knew what a mess meant. It meant food, and George was pretty hungry. He had asked his dad if they could have a practice camp out. That way George could be prepared for the real one with the Beaver Scouts. Come on, soldier, George's dad said. Let's get these burgers onto underground. As George's dad started grilling, George split apart buns, topping each side with a slice of cheese. It was fun camping with his dad, even if it was only in the backyard. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie in George's pocket started buzz. Actually, it was only his mom's cell phone. But for today, George and his dad was calling it a walkie-talkie. George looked at the caller ID. It was his mom calling George from inside the house. Hi, his mom said. I just looked out the window and saw that it was getting windy. Do you want me to bring out your jacket? No, Mom, George said. I'm fine. How about your slippers? His mom suggested. Your feet may get cold. You don't bring slippers on a camping trip, even if it's just a backyard. George took a deep breath. I gotta go, Ma, he said finally. Okay, his mom said, but you can call later if you need something, or if you decide you'd rather sleep inside. Soldier, it's time to pour the bug juice, George's dad said as George hung up the phone. Roger that, George answered. He poured 2 big glasses of bug juice and sat down. The juice was bright red. It looked like it was made of spider blood, except it wasn't really. It was actually just sugar and water and red fruit coloring. See, isn't living in the great outdoors wonderful? George's dad said as he brought over a pile of burgers. Definitely, George agreed. He took a big bite of burger. A glob of ketchup shot out from under the bun and landed on his sweatshirt. George just left it there. He didn't have to clean it. Soldiers didn't call dinner time a mess for nothing. I think tonight we soldiers better be on the lookout, George's dad told him. You mean sneak out of you? George's dad told him. For what? George asked. Enemy soldiers. George's dad shook his head. No, for your mom. He took a bite of his burger, and a giant glob of mustard shot out and landed on his pants. She's liable to come out here and make us use napkins. Did you and your dad have fun last night? Alex asked the next afternoon as the boys took a table up at a pizza palace. Yeah, George said. We had a great time. Real messy. Just then, Mr. Tarantella, the guy who ran the pizza palace, walked over to their tables. "Hey guys," he said, "so what'll it be?" George looked at the menu. Ordering pizza was serious business. You had to pick just the right toppings. I think today I'll have a personal-sized pizza with sausages, pepperonis, and meatballs. I'll just have a plain, personal-sized pizza," Alex said. "You got it," Mr. Tarantella told them, coming right up. "So now you must be really psyched about the scout camping trip," Alex said. "I guess," George said. But he didn't sound so sure. But he didn't sound so sure. "I've got all my gear ready. I just hope something else doesn't sneak along with me." "You mean sneak out of you," Alex said. Alex was the only other person in the whole world who knew about the magical super burp. George hadn't told another soul. He figured people would think he was nuts. Actually, George hadn't told Alex about the burp either. Alex was just too smart. That he'd figure it out. Maybe if I find a cure, it'll be like a medical breakthrough. Or be in the news. Who knows? I could win a Nobel Prize. "Alex, I don't think a whole lot of people are suffering from you-know-what." George pointed to his belly. "I'm probably the only person on the planet." Alex nodded. "True, or even if I didn't get famous, I still want to find a cure for you. Last night, I read about a new way to get rid of gas," Alex told George. "It doesn't sound that hard. Are you shh?" George warned. He pointed towards the door. Louis, Max, and Mike had just walked into the pizza palace. All you have to do is chew each bite of food 100 times before you swallow," Alex said, lowering his voice to a whisper. "The food will just slide down. You won't swallow any air with your food. It's swallowing air that makes you burp." Chewing wasn't hard to do. It was worth a try anyway. "I'll have a personal pie with extra cheese and anchovies," George heard Louis said. Ugh, now George didn't feel like he had to burp. He felt like he had to puke. Wow, who would order pizza with hairy fish all over it? Louis, that's who. And Max and Mike, too, of course. They copied everything Louis did. "Hey guys," Juliana waved to George and Alex. She was with Sage. George was kind of surprised to see Juliana with Sage. Juliana was more like one of the guys, and Sage was, well, she was just weird. "Did you order already?" Juliana asked them. Sage gave George a huge smile. "Hi, Georgie." Grr. George hated when Sage called him that, so he looked away and watched Carlo, the guy behind the counter. It was so cool. First, Carlo would take a bar of dough and start rolling it and stretching it out. Then he'd toss the pizza dough up in the air, catch it, and toss it again, turning it into a flat circle. Sometimes Carlo would spin around on his heels and then reach up and catch the dough. Sometimes he would close his eyes, but he never missed. Not once. It was amazing. Sage tapped George on the shoulder. I like your skeleton t-shirt," she said, looking at George's black and white t-shirt. "It's so macho." "We are kind of in the middle of something," George told girls. "Beer Scout talk." "You're planning for a camp out next weekend," Alex explained. "I love camping," Juliana said. "My family has been taking me camping since I was a baby." "Being surrounded by nature is so beautiful," Sage added. "Didn't you think so, Georgie?" George groaned. It's not a beautiful kind of trip, he explained. It's a mudsliding, mosquito-biting, no-shower kind of trip. Not to mention scary stories, Louis added from the seat across the room. Wouldn't you hear the one about the monster that lives in the Waka River? Sam told me that one a long time ago. Yeah, right, Juliana rolled her eyes. I'm not scared of monsters. Of course not, Louis told her. Everyone knows there's no such thing as monsters. For once, George had to agree with Louis. No one in fourth grade believed in monsters anymore. A moment later, Mr. Tarantula came by with 2 pizzas. Yum, I wish we could come on a trip, Juliana said. What, did Juliana mean stage and her? George was talking the first bite of pizza, and he practically choked. Or, no way is that gonna happen. The trip just for Beaver Scouts. Louis told Juliana, you're not in a scout. Tough luck. Sage and I used to be nature Girl Scouts, Juliana told the boys. But then our troop leader moved. Doesn't that count? No, Louis told her. Juliana looked mad. Sage looked sad. Without another word, they walked out and took a booth in the far corner of the restaurant. Now, don't forget, Alex said as he watched George eat. You gotta chew each bite 100 times. George nodded. He opened his mouth and took another bite. Then he started to chew some more. The pizza turned into mushy globs of tomatoes, cheese and sausage, pepperoni and meat barbecue in his mouth. Chew, pizza grease and pepperoni juice slipped out the side of his mouth. Chew. Red sauce ran out of George's mouth like blood. Little slimy bits of sausages came sliding out and landed on George's t-shirt. He was a mess, but it was for a good cause. And then suddenly George felt something brewing in the bottom of his belly. Something bing-bongy and ping-ponging. The super burp was back. And all the chewing in the world wasn't keeping it down. Dude, not again, Alex said nervously. Yes, again. But before George could even nod, his mouth burst open. Gooey, chewy pizza slime drooled all over him. And then, burp. Mamma mia, that was one loud burp. The weirdest, Max added. The goofy weirdest. Chapter 3. George opened his mouth to say, excuse me, but that's not what came out. Instead, George's mouth shouted, time to make some pizza. Before George knew what was happening, his legs started running across the restaurant behind the counter where Carlo tossed the dough. George, no running in the restaurant, Mr. Tarantula said as he brought out more pies for customers. Watch out, George is acting goofy again, Louis said. That kid is so weird. The weirdest, Max agreed. The goofy weirdest, Mike added. George jumped into the counter. His hands reached down and picked up a big blob of white squishy dough. Hey, you can't do that, Carlo yelled at George. No, watch me. Just watch me. Then George started throwing the dough up in the air and catching it. Soon the dough began to spread into a circle. He tossed the pie-shaped dough over and over, higher and higher. Dude, come on. You have to stop, Alex called. But George didn't stop. He couldn't. He wasn't in charge anymore. It was like he was one of those old-fashioned puppets and someone else was pulling the strings. Woohoo! George's mouth shouted out. Who wants a piece of pizza? George's hands landed to catch the flying dough on his way down and missed. A big blob of dough landed right on George's head and oozed down on his face. George poked 2 holes out for his eyes. George Brown, stop it right now! Mr. Tarantula shouted at him. I know it. I knew he'd freak out. Louis kept chatting. Suddenly, George felt something go pop on his belly. It was like someone had just stuck a needle in the balloon. All the air rushed right out of him. The super burp was gone. Everyone was staring at him like he was out of his mind. Then he opened his mouth to say, "I'm sorry." And that was exactly what came out. "I can't believe Mr. Tarantella threw us that all out," Louis groaned. "We didn't even do anything. It's all your fault, George." Louis stared up the street. Louis started up the street. Then he turned back. "I'm warning you, you better not pull any goofy on our camping trip. I don't want to be sent home early from that, too." George gulped. Was there any chance at all that the super burp wouldn't stay away for a whole weekend? Somehow he doubted it. "I'm sorry you didn't get to eat your pizza. I owe you, dude," George said to Alex as they walked home. "It wasn't a total waste. I got 2 pieces and chewed gum from under the table," Alex said. Alex was trying to break the Ximenez Book of World Records for the largest ABC gum bar. George wished he could be happy for Alex, but he wasn't too upset about what had just happened. He was so embarrassed. He didn't think he could ever show his face at a pizza palace again. Grr, first Burp, and then made him freak out at Ernie's, and now the pizza palace. If this kept happening, George wouldn't be able to go into any restaurants in Beaverbrook. He'd probably starve to death. "I thought you were doing a really good job tossing that pizza, though," Sage told George, "at least until it landed on your head. It was pretty funny. You looked like a ghost made out of dough," Juliana said. "Thanks," said George. Then George mumbled under his breath and to Alex that chewing didn't work. "It's okay, dude. I'm working on it," Alex whispered to him. "I'll come up with something." "Boy, George, you just can't stop getting in trouble," Juliana said. "I wish I were going on the camping trip just to see what kind of trouble you get into." George groaned. There was nothing funny about the super burp, at least not to him. Chapter 4. A Beaver Scout is honest and true. A Beaver Scout knows what to do. A Beaver Scout is a loyal friend. He'll be your friend right to the end. The Scout is strong and a Scout is tough. We are Beaver Scouts and that's enough. George said the Beaver Scout oath along with the pals at the troops meeting on Wednesday night. He was really excited. This was an important meeting. They were there to discuss Saturday's big camping trip. "Okay, Scouts," Troop Leader Buttonwood said at the middle of a big circle in a room at the community center. "I have a big news. 2 new Scouts are joining our troop. They'll be here any minute. I know you're going to give them a big Beaver Scout workup." "Who are they?" George asked. The door to the room burst open. "I'm sorry, are we late?" Juliana and Sage were dressed in Beaver Scout uniforms and carrying Beaver Scout guidebooks. "Hi, guys," Juliana said to the Scout. "Hi," Sage added. "Did I surprise you, Georgie?" George was so surprised he couldn't answer. "You don't belong here," Louis said. "We are having our Beaver Scout troop meeting." "We are Beaver Scouts," Juliana told him. "See, we have the uniforms and the guidebooks." "Yeah, we bought them yesterday," Sage added. "Girls can't be Beaver Scouts," Louis told Juliana and Sage. "Who says?" Juliana asked him. "It's in the guidebook," Louis told them. "Wrong!" Juliana held up her guidebook. "Actually, the girls are right. The new guidebook was changed. Now, Beaver Scout doesn't have to be a boy." Troop Leader Buttonwood told everyone. It just says a Beaver Scout has to be between the ages of 8 and 11 and work to earn badges. Welcome to Troop 307, girls. Leo was so mad. It looked like the steam was going to come out of his ears. This is so wrong, he shouted. My dad is going to be really mad. When he hears about it, he's gonna sue. And he can, because he's a lawyer. He'll take this case all the way up to the Supreme Court if he has to. Well, until he does, the girls are part of our troop, Troop Leader Buttonwood told Louis. And we will treat them with respect like any other scouts. Juliana and Sage smiled and sat down in a circle. Juliana tried to sit down next to George, but Sage squeezed in between them. Isn't this great, Georgie? Sage asked George. She batted her eyelashes at him. We're going to spend the whole weekend together on a camping trip. George didn't answer. He had really been looking forward to the camping trip. Now, between the Super, Burp, and Sage, so much could go wrong. Beaver Scouts were supposed to be prepared, so George spent the next few days preparing for the campout in his own way. He did everything he could think of to put an end to the magic burps. He didn't drink any soda. He didn't eat beans. He chewed each mouthful of food. He ate 100 times and figured that maybe Alex's cure needed longer to work. It took forever to get through a meal, and his jaws ached like crazy. Still, he hadn't burped once in 3 days. That was a good sign, wasn't it? Or was a burp waiting to pop out on the camping trip? You're sure you have everything? George's mom asked as she said goodbye to George at the campgrounds on Saturday morning. Yep, I'm good, George said. Dad helped me pack last night. You have an extra sweatshirt in case it gets chilly at night? His mom asked. Yep, and my toothbrush, George said. I told you that in the car. Okay, his mom said. I'm going to leave then. Have a great weekend. As his mom drove off, George lugged his gear over to where Alex and Chris was. Cool stuff, Chris said. It is our genius army. Yep, George said proudly. He looked down at his dad's old camouflage print sleeping bag and his regulation U.S. Army water canteen. Having a dad in the army was pretty cool sometimes. I got my sleeping bag from my aunt for my birthday last year, Chris said. Chris's sleeping bag had comic superheroes all over it. Mine is just a regular sleeping bag, Alex said, but the guy at the store said it would keep me warm, and I brought my binoculars too. Just then, Louis drove up in a limo. He got out carrying his guitar, and that was it. He didn't have any gear at all. Weird. A minute later, Max and Mike arrived. From the back of the van, they got lots and lots and lots of gear. You practically couldn't even see them underneath the pile of sleeping bags, battery-operated fans, plastic folding lawn chairs, a blow-up mattress, and big cans of Bucks Ready. Louis, hey Louis, Mike shouted. We bought everything you said. No worries. Just then George felt someone clap their hands over his eyes. Guess who? A voice behind him asked. George might not have been able to see anything, but he could hear that just fine. It's you, Sage, he grumbled. Yes, Sage said, taking her hands away from George's face. I'm here, ready to go camping. George kicked at the ground and frowned. Hey guys, Juliana said, walking up the hill just behind Sage. Ready to go? Juliana's backpack was really cool. It was covered with patches from all over the world: France, Spain, Argentina, Egypt, Israel, South Africa, Nigeria. George read the names of the countries on the patches. "Hey, how do you say this one?" he asked, pointing to the patch that read Kyrgyzstan. "I don't know," Juliana answered. "My parents bought it back from a trip." She fingered the compass she was wearing on a rope around her neck. "They brought this back from the rainforest in Costa Rica." "Did you see my new boots, Georgie?" Sage asked. Sage was wearing bright pink rubber boots. "Why are you wearing rain boots?" he asked her. "It's not supposed to rain," Sage shrugged. "Juliana told me I needed boots." "Hiking boots," Juliana said. "Not rain boots." "But these were prettier," Sage said. "Hiking boots only came in black or brown. And these pink boots match my necklace and my bracelet." George rolled his eyes. What kind of Beaver Scout wore pink boots and jewelry? A Sage kind of Beaver Scout. Just then, Troop Leader Buttonwood started to run over to them where the scouts were standing. Bam! A minute later, he was on the ground. He tripped over one of the laces on his hiking boots. I'm okay, he told the scouts. "I meant to do that. Just wanted you all to know. Make sure you tied your boots." "I don't have laces," Sage said. "Rain boots don't have laces." She turned to George. "But your boots does. Better double knot that bunny ears so you don't get hurt, Georgie." Louis and his echo started to laugh. George wondered if there was a badge for being annoying in the camping ground trip, because it sure seemed like Sage was doing her best to earn it. Chapter 5. Thump, bump, plop. "Oh no, not again," George groaned as his tent fell down on top of him. Again. He crawled out from under the thick green tent tarp and looked up at Alex and Chris. "Why can't we get this thing to stay up? That last time it should have worked," Alex said. It shouldn't have collapsed. At least worked. This time it should have worked. That last time it should have worked. "Oh no, not again," George groaned as his tent fell down on top of him. Again. He crawled out from under the thick green tent tarp and looked up at Alex and Chris. "Why can't we get this thing to stay up? That last time it should have worked," Alex said. "It shouldn't have collapsed, at least not according to any rule of science." "I don't think science has anything to do with this," Chris said. "Sure it does," Alex said. "It's physics." Because George had already stopped listening to Alex. Right now, around the same time, he said science. It was good to have a really smart friend, but right now, Alex's science smarts weren't helping at all. "We have to try again," George said. He picked up the tent poles and started putting them back together. George and his buddies weren't the only ones having a tough time with their tent. Louis, Max, and Mike were struggling too, or Max and Mike were anyhow. Louis were busy sitting on a folding chair, strumming his guitar. "Oomph!" Max groaned as he jabbed himself with a pole. Louis' tent was huge. It had big flaps that were up and down on the sides and windows with netting to keep out the mosquitoes. "Hurry up," Louis said to Mike. "I want to be the first to get our tent all set up." "Sorry," Mike apologized. "We'll try to work faster." Max looked down at the instructions that came with Louis' tent. "These aren't in English," he said. "Anyone here speaks Japanese. There, Juliana announced suddenly, are finished. George looked over to where Juliana and Sage were standing. Sure enough, their tent was set up. You guys need any help? Juliana asked, walking over to where George, Chris, and Alex were struggling. Yeah, George said. I can't get the poles to stay together. That's because you got them upside down, Juliana said. Here, let me show you. She picked up the poles and fit them together. Then she grabbed the top. In about 5 minutes, the boys' tent was standing tall. Ah! Suddenly, Louis jumped out of his chair and started screaming, Bug, get that thing away from me. He picked up 2 cans of bug spray and started spraying wildly in the air. Cut that out, Sage shouted. Everyone stopped and stared. Sage did a lot of goofy things, but she didn't usually shout. Bugs are living things, she told Louis. You can't just kill them. Oh, no? Louis asked her. Watch me. He sprayed at the air again. What did the bug ever do to you? Sage asked Louis. He bugged me, Louis said. Max and Mike began to laugh. The bug bugged him. Max said, Get it? Good one, Louis, Mike added. Bug spray isn't good for the environment, Juliana told Louis. I've got something better. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a candle. A candle? Louis asked. What's a candle gonna do? It's a citronella candle, Juliana corrected Louis. It has a smell that keeps mosquitoes and bugs away without killing them. Great idea, Juliana, Troop Leader Buttonwood told her. You came prepared like a good Beaver Scout should. And because you did, you have earned the first badge of the camping trip. The Ecology badge. Congratulations, Sage gave Juliana a hug. The bugs are, thank you, she said. Louis just rolled his eyes. Then he turned to Max and Mike. They looked really proud because they'd finally gotten the tent to stand. You guys set the tent up with a rock right in the middle, Louis yelled at them. I'm not sleeping on any rock. But then Max said, That's okay. I'll sleep on the rocky part. It won't hurt me. My dad's always saying I've got rocks for brains anyway. George laughed. That was actually pretty funny. Even if all the rocks for brains Max. If old rocks for brains, Max didn't get the joke. Troop Leader Buttonwood asked for everyone's attention. Okay, before we go on our canoe trip, there are a few safety rules I want to go over with you. He said, first, we need to keep the campsite clean. And we need to keep all the foods locked up in the crates I brought along. That will keep the raccoons away. Juliana said, exactly. Troop Leader Buttonwood agreed. There are all kinds of animals in the woods. Most of them won't bother us if we don't bother them, except for, of course, if we happen to run into Triple F. Who's that? George asked. That's the dumb monster on the troop. Or the troop leaders are stupid. Scary stories about Louis told Troop and looked at the troop leader Buttonwood. Right? Maybe the stories are stupid. And maybe they're not. Troop Leader Buttonwood said. Well, you've never seen a monster, have you? Louis insisted. Troop Leader Buttonwood shook his head. But just because I haven't seen one doesn't mean they don't exist. George shivered a little. He didn't believe in monsters, but what the troop leader had said made sense. Troop Leader Buttonwood turned to all the scouts. Enough about the rules. Let's head down to the river. Put on your life jackets and go canoeing. Yay! The kids all cheered excitedly as the scouts headed down to where the canoe was docked. Alex whispered to George, "How's the gas situation?" George struggled. "So far, so good." "I hope it stays that way," Alex says to him. Then he heard two crossed fingers. Chapter 6. "I don't see why we can't have 3 people in a canoe," George grumbled as he put on his yellow life jacket. "It's not fair. Sorry, dude," Alex said. "If we want our badges, we have to do it with only 2 people in the canoe. Don't be mad at us. Troop Leader Buttonwood, the one put you in the canoe with Sage." "It won't be so bad," Chris said. "You don't have to talk to her." This really stunk. Chris and Alex ought to be together in a canoe. Max was with Louie and Mike was with Juliana, but George was stuck in a canoe with Sage. This was the worst. "At least you're not with Louie," Alex pointed out. That was true. Being with Louie would be worse. "Come on, Georgie," Sage called to him. "Let's get paddling." Or maybe not. Being with Sage was going to be awful. "I'll go in front," Sage said to Georgie. As George climbed into the canoe. "You can be in the stern steer because you're stronger than me." George climbed into the back of the canoe. This trip wasn't turning out to be the way he'd hoped. But a few minutes later, George felt happier. He was paddling down the river, and he realized he didn't have to pay attention to Sage. He couldn't just focus on steering the canoe around the bends on the river. Every now and then, Sage lost control of her paddles and splashed herself. That was pretty funny. Suddenly, a strong wind started to blow. The canoe picked up speed. "Woohoo!" George shouted. "This is awesome!" "Yikes!" Sage cried. "Georgie, we're going too fast. Make it stop." "How?" George asked it. The canoe bounced up and down, and then George noticed something else bouncing around. Gas. And it was bouncing in his belly. Oh no, the super burp was back right in the middle of the Waka Waka Oka River. George wasn't sure what the burp might do if it escaped now. All he knew was it would be bad. George had to stop that burp. We started rocking back and forth. Maybe he could put the burp to sleep. "Georgie, stop that! We're tapped!" Sage shouted. The burp kept bouncing. Bing, bong, ping, pong. George twisted to the left. He twisted to the right. Maybe he could twist his stomach into a knot and tie off the burp. He splashed. The canoe tripped over. "Ah!" Sage cried out as she fell into the river. "Whoops!" George shouted as he went under. Pop! Just then George felt something burst in the belly. All the air rushed out of him. George had scorched the belch. "Yahoo!" he shouted. Oops! George was still underwater. The minute he opened his mouth and let out "Yahoo!" he let in a whole lot of cold river water and wiggly jiggly fish too. But that was okay. Nothing mattered except that George had beaten the burp. His head popped up out of the water and he gave a V for victory sign. "Georgie, Georgie, help!" Sage cried out suddenly. George looked over at Sage. She was bobbing in the water as the canoe was moving down the river. "Help me!" she cried again. George knew Sage really didn't need help. She was wearing a life jacket, and the water was only a few feet deep. "Georgie, I'm a bad swimmer!" Sage cried out again. Beaver Scouts had to be prepared, so George guessed he better be prepared to save Sage before saving the canoe. He started to swim to her, but the current was strong. Suddenly, Sage started to swing to George. Then she reached to him. She wrapped her arms around her neck. "Oh, Georgie, pull me to shore." A minute later, they were both standing in the mud on the side of the river. "I thought you said you're a bad swimmer," George grumbled as he struggled out of Sage's arm. Well, I am, usually," Sage said. "I guess it was just your animal magnetism." It drew me right to you. You saved me. I was going under. I could see my life flashing before my eyes. I was in a tunnel with the light at. George didn't wait to hear anymore. He jumped back into water and swam to the canoe. It had gotten stuck on shore a feet a little farther down the river. George flipped and back over. Now it was right side up and ready to go. Troop leader but no one could name to them. So did the other kids. Are you okay? Troop leader asked Sage and George. He saved my life, Sage said. George is a hero. We laughed. More like a zero. Did you guys see how he flipped that canoe over? Max and Mike cracked it, but Troop leader but Noah didn't laugh at all. Did you see how George flipped it back? That's exactly what you're supposed to do when a canoe capsizes. George also needs to come to the aid for another scout first. So George is getting 2 badges, one for canoeing and a special one for water safety. Wow, Alex said. 2 badges? Impressive, dude. Thanks, George said. It was no big deal. That's not fair, Louis shouted. If I had known I could get another badge, I would have flipped my canoe. Yeah, Max said. And he would have flipped it better. Louis is always flipping. Exactly, Mike agreed. No one flips out like Louis. Now that we know everyone's okay, Troop Leader Buttonwood said, let's get paddling back to camp. He was about to step into the canoe when he lost his balance. Whoosh! Troop Leader Buttonwood went sliding. He slided face first into slimy mud. It's okay, he called back to the kids. I meant to do that. It's just trying to show you how much fun it is to go mudsliding. That looks like fun, Juliana said. She slid down the mud too. Awesome, George exclaimed. He lay on his back and swished down in the mud, feet first. Check it out, Chris shouted. It's a tournament to the rescue. He got on his belly and slid face first down to the muddy hill and into the river. Hey, George, Alex cried out. Think fast. George grinned as Alex threw a big, huge pile of slimy, grimy goo mud right at him. There was mud in the hair, in his ears, and under his arms. Some mud had even slimed its way into the bathing suit and onto his butt. That was really fun. Normal kid fun. Not the Super Burp's idea of fun. Bonk. Chapter 7. Whoa, what's that? Hey, watch out! Louis shouted at George. You almost hit me with that tree branch. George moved out of Louis's way and carried his pile of wood down to the fire pit. His arms were really tired. He'd carried a lot of wood to the campsite, so had everybody else, everybody but Louis. He pointed out which pieces of wood Max and Mike would have to carry for him. Whoa, Max shouted as he banged into a tree. He couldn't see over the humongous pile of branches he was carrying. Hey, check out these paw prints, Chris cried out suddenly. They're huge. Alex, George, and Sage stopped and stared down at the ground. You don't think they're bear prints, do you? George asked his friends. Alex shook his head. Bear prints have 4 round tails, but these prints look long and skinny and way bigger. Besides, the Beaver Scouts would never let us go camping here if there were bears in the woods. Then what kind of tracks are they? George asked him. I think I may have an idea, Troop Leader Buttonwood said mysteriously. I'll tell you all about it tonight. He's going to tell us that they belong to a monster, just like Sam said he would, Louis joked. Like anyone would believe that. I wouldn't believe it, Max said. Me neither, Mike agreed. For once, George thought Louis and the Echoes were right. There were no such thing as monsters. The tracks were right there, and no one seemed to know what kind of animal they could belong to. At least the tracks are heading away from the cabin site, that Sage pointed out. That was true. The tracks were heading straight into the woods. We better make tracks, George said. The sooner we get to the woods, to the fire, the sooner we eat. A little while later, Juliana was busy at the fire, pit harping to Leader, but no one burned the fire. Hand me some more twigs, Juliana told Chris. We have to finish building the pyramid so we can start a fire. Georgie and I collected a whole lot of twigs, Sage told Juliana. He's got a great eye for twigs. George kicked at the dirt. Sage hadn't left his side all afternoon. How was he ever going to get rid of her? When the wood was all laid out, the troop leader lit a match. Ouch! Troop leader Buttonwood shouted suddenly. He wiggled his finger in the air. Are you okay? Juliana said. Yeah, he said as he blew on his finger. I meant to burn my finger. I wanted to teach you kids to be careful with matches. Fire safety is a big part of camping. It makes teamwork to build a fire. Troop leader Buttonwood continued as he handed out sticks for cooking hot dogs. That's why you are getting your fire safety badges. That didn't seem very fair. Louis hadn't done anything, but George didn't say that. It would be tattling. And George Brown was no tattler. Rumble, grumble. Just then George heard something rumbling in the bottom of his belly. Rumble, grumble, gulp. Oh no, was the burp back? George's stomach rumbled again. It grumbled again. And then it didn't do anything else. George was just hungry. Soon George was holding a long stick over the fire. He watched his hot dog plump up. I love hot dogs, Alex said, as he moved his hot dog over the fire next to George's. Me too, George said, especially when you are burned. They are burned a little. He pulled his stick out of the fire and plopped the hot dog on a bun. A minute later, he took a big bite. Oh yeah, perfect, he said and then began chewing 100 times, just to be on the safe side. We have marshmallows too, Sage said later. Once everyone had finished off 2 hot dogs, she smiled at George. Would you like me to make you a toasted marshmallow? No thanks, he told her. Cooking them is half the fun. He stuck 3 marshmallows on the stick and went back to the fire. Max and Mike were already roasting marshmallows. Done, Max said. Then he ran over to Louie. I made a marshmallow for you. Mike was right behind him. No way, I was making one for Louie. I made mine first, Max said. I made mine better, Max said. I made mine better, Mike insisted. He shoved a cooked marshmallow in Louie's face. Try it. Max tried to shove Mike's stick away. Ow! Louie shouted suddenly. A gooey marshmallow was stuck right on his nose. Who did it? It was him, Max and Mike said, pointing at each other. George started to laugh. Louie was standing there with a toasted marshmallow hanging off the tip of his nose like a ginormous white booger. Camping sure was great. Once the sun had gone down, the woods grew very dark. Beside the campfire, the only light came from the full moon. George was glad that they'd collected so much wood. If that fire went out, it would be really spooky out there. I know I told you guys about the raccoons and the bats, Troop Leader Buttonwood said suddenly, but I think you should also be on the lookout for the ferocious furry frog. The what? George asked. Here it comes, Louie said. The monster story. What did I tell you? The ferocious furry frog, Troop Leader Buttonwood repeated. or triple Fs, or some call them. He's part frog and part bear. He is huge. Troop leader Buttonwood stroked his chin. I've never seen him myself, he went on, but they say he lives in these parts, and he doesn't like company. Is this for little bear? Chris said. Troop leader Buttonwood shrugged. It's up to you to decide. It's a story, Juliana said. My dad likes to tell stories about the older Cropsey ghost when we go on camping trips. Telling scary stories is part of camping. Could be, Troop Leader Buttonwood said, but as your Beaver Scout troop leader, it's my job to warn you just the same. Since he's part bear, Triple F hibernates. But unlike other bears, he sleeps in the summer, right around now, and he doesn't like his sleep to be disturbed. So if you go out into the woods, be very, very quiet. The ferocious furry frog a vegetarian? Sage asked. Is the ferocious furry frog a vegetarian? Sage asked nervously. Oh no, he's a meat eater. Troop leader Buttonwood told her. But he doesn't eat campers, right? Sage asked. Oh, come on, Louis said. He scratched his big Band-Aid, and Dad was covering the burn on his nose. A giant hairy frog that eats campers. Who'll believe that? Me, Mike said. It could be possible, Max added. It was the first time George had ever heard either of them disagree with Louis, and it was the first time George had ever agreed with Louis. He thought Triple F was just a story too. Suddenly George stood up. He had to go to the bathroom. He looked around the campsite. Hey, where's the toilet? He asked Troop Leader Buttonwood. Someone stole the toilet, Chris laughed. This is a case of toilet man. George frowned. No, come on. There has to be an outhouse at least. I'm afraid not. Troop Leader Buttonwood shook his head. You have to go in the woods. George gulped. The woods where Triple F lived? Not that George believed the story was true or anything, but sir, bring your flashlight. Troop Leader Buttonwood told him. Just don't go far. You'll be fine. Really? George wasn't so sure. Who knew what could be waiting for him once he got into the woods alone? Chapter 8. It's not so dark. George chanted to himself as he walked into the woods. But it was dark. Even with the full moon overhead and a flashlight, the campsite wasn't far ahead. He was close enough to hear Louis playing his guitar. If George could hear the other scouts, then they could hear him if he had to scream for help. What could go wrong? Uh-oh, George felt something bouncing up and down inside his belly. Something that ping-ponged. Something even scarier than being in the woods alone. The super burp was back. George had to stop that burp. He shut his lips tight and hard his nose. He swallowed really hard, trying to force the burp back down his throat. But the super burp had been kept down for too long. It needed to break free. The bubbles bounced their way into George's chest. They ping-ponged up his throat and ping-ponged all the way to his mouth. They tickled and tongued and danced around the teeth, and then burp. George let out a burp so loud it woke the animals. Squeak, chirp, chatter. The animals began answering George's call on the wire. The next thing George knew, he was going wild. Ribbit, ribbit, roar! His mouth shouted out. Then he started hopping like a frog. Ribbit, ribbit, roar! George's mouth shouted again. Ah! George's ear heard shouts and screaming coming from the campsite. Ah! George heard Louis shout. It's the Triple F monster. He's real. Oh no, my Georgie is trapped in the woods with the monster, Sage cried out. George wanted to shout that he wasn't Sage's Georgie and he wasn't Triple F. But all that came out was rivet, rivet, roar. George's legs scrambled over to a nearby tree. His back started scratching against the tree bark like a big bear. Rabbit, rabbit, roar, his mouth shouted. A moment later, all the scout and troop leader buttons surrounded him. A flashlight was pointed right at his eyes. Juliana was holding it. George, Arden, noise, it was you, Juliana shouted. Everybody looked really, really mad, all except Alex. He knew what was going on. Then George felt something go pop. It was like a bee stinger bursting a balloon in the bottom of his belly. The air rushed right out of him. The super burp was gone. George, the troop leader shouted, why were you making all this noise? You scared the whole troop. George opened his mouth to say, I'm sorry, and that's exactly what came out. Don't try anything like that again, Troop Leader Buttonwood told him. There's no badge for practical joking, you know? Yes, sir, George answered. I knew it was him all the time, Louis said as he picked a piece of white marshmallow booger out of his nostril. He didn't scare me one bit. Now, come on, Troop Leader Button said. He turned and tripped over a rock. I'm okay, he told the kids. I meant to do that to show you there was a rock there. Don't trip over it when you walk back to the campsite. I can't go back yet, George told him. Why not? Troop Leader Buttonwood asked. Because I still have to, George answered. Oh, Troop Leader understood. Okay, but hurry up. It's almost time for lights out. And no more fooling around. George nodded and waited for everyone to leave. Toilet or no toilet, they had to go now. There were some things even the super burp couldn't control. Whoa. Chapter 9. You're supposed to wave the fly swatter at the sky, Louis told Max and Mike early the night next morning as Troop 307 went on their nature hike in the woods. When you guys volunteered to swat all the flies that came near me, I thought you would do it right. Sorry, Louis, Max said. We'll swat the next fly, Mike added. You'll see. Suddenly a fly landed right on Louis' nose. Max and Mike slammed their saddles right down on it. Ouch! Louis shouted. What did you do that for? We were swatting the fly, Max explained. But we missed, Mike added. Louis scowled and rubbed the bandage that was covering his burned, sore nose. This hike is the pits, he said. Actually, Louis wasn't the only kid who felt that way. Beaver Scout Troop 307 had been hiking in the woods for hours, or at least it seemed that way to George, but they didn't seem to be getting anywhere. They were just going around and around in circles. I think we walked past the same tree a while ago, Alex told Troop Leader Buttonwood. How do you know if it's the same tree? Louis asked Alex. All these trees look alike. Look, Alex pointed to a small brown nest high up in the branches. I already spotted that yellow-bellied sapsucker in their nest 20 minutes ago. I checked it off my list. I'm really close to getting that bird-watching badge. That's a dweeby badge, Louis told Alex. It is not, Alex insisted. There are no dweeby Beaver Scout badges. Boys, stop arguing, Troop Leader Buttonwood said. I'm trying to figure out where we are. You mean you don't really know? Sage asked him. Well, we traveled off the trail, Troop Leader Buttonwood said. But don't worry, I have a map of the Beaver Scout campgrounds. He reached into the backpack and dug around. At least I thought I brought the map, unless, Juliana asked him, unless I didn't. I was studying it this morning to see which trail to take, and I must have left it on my tent. Sage looked like she was going to cry. Oh no, we're lost in the woods! Just then, a brown and black chipmunk raced across the path. Louis jumped and let out a scream. George laughed. It's just a chipmunk, Louis, he said. Swish! That wasn't a chipmunk. It was a big rat, Louis said. He looked at Max and Mike. Wasn't it, you guys? Well, it had a tail. Max said, rats have tails. And it was sort of fat. Max said, rats are fat sometimes. See? Louis told George. Ouch! I think I just got stung by something. I hate bugs, Louis shouted. And I hate rats. What kind of wood are these anyway? Sage grabbed George's arm. I'm glad you're here to protect me from the wild rats and mosquitoes. George yanked away his arm. Who knew who was going to protect him from Sage? I know we're supposed to be heading north, Troop Leader Buttonwood said. But which way is north? He looked around. The sun rises at the east and sets in the west. Does anybody remember where the sunrise started? My feet were sweating in these boots, Sage complained. They're going to stink. They're because your boots are made of rubber, Max told him. Rubber makes your feet sweaty. Now you tell me, Sage looked at Juliana. My stinky, sweaty feet are all your fault. It's not my fault, Juliana insisted. Kids, calm down. Troop Leader Buttonwood insisted. I can figure this out, I think. You think? Sage shouted. I'll get us out of this. Lee reached into his backpack and pulled out a cell phone. I'll call my dad. He'll send a park ranger or something to help us. He looked down at the phone. Hey, I'm not getting any service. What kind of uncivilized woods are these anyway? Woods are supposed to be uncivilized, George said. That's the whole point. Yeah, well, I want to get back to civilization, Louis said. And now I am supposed to do that without the cell phone? With this, Juliana said. She held up a compass around her neck. The arrow will tell us which way is north. Great, Troop Leader Buttonwood said. You saved us, Sage exclaimed. Georgia looked over at Louis as the troop hiked north. And you didn't want Juliana to come on this camping trip. Louis rolled his eyes. So she has a necklace with an arrow. Big deal. Not a necklace, a compass. Juliana corrected him. And it's a huge deal, Alex said. It'll help us get back to the campsite. It's also earning Juliana her Explorer badge. Troop Leader Buttonwood said. Cool beans, Chris exclaimed. Congratulations, and I'm sorry for getting mad before. Sage told Juliana. Hey, Louis, George said. Isn't that the Explorer badge the only one your brother Sam didn't get? Louis didn't say a word. He just looked ahead and kept hiking. George grinned. The compass really was something special. It was the only thing George had never ever seen that could shut Louis up. Well, Chapter 10. By the time Troop 307 got back to the campsite, they were hot, tired, and really, really hungry. We're going to have hamburgers, Troop Leader Buttonwood told the troops. But I think we're running a little low on firewood. I'll get some, George said. He wanted to be extra helpful to make up for his burp out last night. Great, Troop Leader Buttonwood said. We don't need a lot because we're going to put the fire out right after lunch. So just get some twigs and a few thick branches. Whoa. I'll help you, Georgie, Sage said. I can handle it, George told her. Then he hurried into the woods. It was amazing how not scary the woods really were in the daylight. Last night it had been really creepy out there, but now George thought it was kind of nice to be alone. Crack! But was he alone? Crack! George heard A noise again. It sounded like a twig breaking under someone's foot. Oh no, was Sage following him again? George turned, but he didn't see Sage crack. There was it again. Rabbit! Okay, that wasn't Sage. Roar! Gulp! Nah, George knew for sure he wasn't alone. Two big green paws attached to the two big green and furry arms spread apart the bushes. Holy catch-molly! Suddenly, George found himself standing face to face with Trapper F. This thing was real, and it was at least 8 feet tall. Roar! Rabbit! Roar! The ferocious furry frog growled at George. Then it hopped toward him. George gulped. He blinked his eyes. He still couldn't believe that he was sleeping. Trapper F was really real. And from the way it was smacking its big green lips, it was clearly hungry. Unfortunately, the only thing in the menu was George. This was about as bad as things could get. And then these things got worse. Oh no, a super burp was bing-bonging around George's belly. Ribbit, roar! Trapper F growled. Bing-bong, ping-pong, ribbit. Bing-bong, ribbit. Burp! George let out a huge, super loud super burp. The force of the burp shook the trees so hard leaves fell off. Trapper F's frog eyes bugged out at the sound. The monster blinked as if it couldn't believe what it was seeing. The fur stood up in its back. Trapper F let out a mighty rabbit roar. He stared at Jack, and then it hopped off into the forest as fast as its frog legs could go. George couldn't believe it. The super burp had scared off Trapper F. And then suddenly George felt something pop in his belly. All the air rushed out of him. The super burp was gone. But George was still there, and he knew exactly what he had to do. Run! What do you mean? Where's the wood? Where's the wood? George asked his friends a few minutes later when he got to the campsite. Didn't you hear what I just told you? I saw Trapper F, and I scared it away. All I hear is my stomach grumbling, Louis told him. And we can cook the hamburgers until we have some wood. But it was huge, George said. It couldn't have eaten us all. Those humongous animal tracks we saw when we got here yesterday, I bet those were Trapper F's. And you should have heard it roar. We heard something that sounded like a loud rock rabbit, Juliana said. Only it was you. Again, just like last time, Sage said. George looked at Alex. Not even his best friend believed him. Of course it was hard to believe his gigantic furry frog scared off by a super burp. Unless you were there to see it. This really stunk. George deserved a merit badge for bravery. For once, the super burp had done something right and nobody cared. Beaver Scouts. Chapter 11. And here's your Explorer badge, Troop Leader Buttonwood said at the next troop meeting. He handed Juliana a badge with the telescope on it. Juliana was beaming. Thanks, she said. Everyone in the troop was taking home badges to sew onto their uniforms. Did you see my bird watching badge? Alex told George. It got a robin on it. Georgie, look! Sage shouted. A badge with flower on it under George's nose. I got it for identifying wildflowers. Isn't it adorable? George rolled his eyes. You didn't car Beaver Scout badge is adorable. Your water safety badge is great, Sage went on. Every time I see you wearing it, I remember how you saved my life. George turned to Chris. Let me see your art badge again. Sure, Chris said. Chris had made a huge toilet man statue out of papier-mâché. He had brought it to the meeting to show everyone. A roll of toilet paper hung from toilet man's plunger. George laughed. Nice job, dude, he said. Now here we are set for the next camping trip, toilet man. Chris smiled. Exactly. A Beaver Scout is always prepared, he joked. Forget toilet paper. George was prepared in case something even worse came up in the next camping trip. Triple F repellent. And it came in the form of a magical super burp. Hey, at least it was good for something. The end of George Brown Class Clown. Hey, who stole the toilet? The end.